How does the story of Lexington, the great American stud horse, link in and relate to the story of black people in the USA? Geraldine Brooks is an American-Australian author who has won the Pulitzer Prize. She wrote books such as The Year of Wonder and People of the Book, and this is her sixth novel. A novel about a real horse, Lexington, written over 3 separate timelines. 1850s Kentucky, when Lexington lived. 1954 New York, where a gallery owner comes across a painting of Lexington. And 2019 Washington, where a scientist working for the Smithsonian reconstructs a horse skeleton and meets a Nigerian art historian. While this book is about a horse, his career and his legacy, it is also about injustices, slavery, racism, the American Civil War, culture, belonging somewhere, and fitting in. This was my very first Geraldine Brooks novel, and I was most impressed with how well researched she was. This is a technically excellent novel, a historical fiction and a contemporary fiction about a horse which focuses on people and their relationship. It has this nice double of being both accessible and just enjoyable for pleasure readers, and having a bit more meat on the bones for hardened readers of literary fiction. It's a real good all-rounder, and one that I expect to see in the discussion for next year's Women's and Booker prizes. Jess is an Australian scientist with a fascination for dead things and reconstructing their skeletons. Everybody is impressed by big animals such as blue whales, but it's her reconstruction of small things that showcase her skill. She is awkward, nerdy, funny, and from a working class bogan background. By the way, quick lesson in Aussie slang. The word bogan can loosely be translated to the stereotyped view you probably have of an Australian in your country. Although over here it can be a slur calling you uncultured, or a term of endearment calling you uncultured. It often conveys blue collar and working class as well. I love Jess. She accidentally ends up living in Washington and working at the Smithsonian, reconstructing a horse skeleton who is clearly Lexington. And as she places Lexington back together, she observes things about his body, things which link back to the 1850s timeline. I also loved Theo, the very posh, Eton-educated Nigerian art historian who Jess develops a crush on. Theo has spent time living in Canberra and has a Kelpie, a common as mud Australian sheepdog, and a type of dog that I am guessing that most Americans will be quite unfamiliar with. The power dynamic of their relationship is something I'd love to have explored more in other books. Theo is significantly better off and more cultured than Jess, yet he has black skin, and Jess has white skin. Theo's attempts to date black American girls have failed. They've called him white because he's foreign and he didn't understand local cultural references. He started singing songs he heard at the shopping centres, not realising that they had a racist past. Theo feels happier with Jess. She understands all the Aussie slang he has picked up. Jess is constantly worried she is being racist towards Theo. She is legitimately fantasizing about having children with him, yet she's worried about stereotyping him. Jarrett is an enslaved groom who forms a bond with a horse he loves, Lexington. He looks after him, knows what he needs, and understands the horse. And he can make a lot of money for his owners by racing Lexington. But there are things Jarrett doesn't understand. As he is sold with his horse, his role often changes, having to earn the trust of the man who has just purchased him. Meanwhile, Lexington is being mistreated. This part very much reminded me of Alex Haley's Roots and the character George. Both Jarrett and George were very talented horse trainers who made their white owners lots of money, and apparently this was a thing. Jarrett is looking after Lexington at the time of the Civil War, which creates an added form of complexity. The treatment of Jarrett and Lexington and the comparison between them is fascinating. They are both property, and at its most literal interpretation, black slaves weren't even treated as well as animals. Lexington's history and his breeding is more highly valued than that of Jarrett's. The treatment of Jarrett by the people around him and the treatment of Theo in the modern timeline is also there to be considered. Theo was a champion polo player, and the treatment he received playing polo is actually very similar to the treatment Jarrett received racing Lexington. Yet Theo was able to attend Eton, own multiple horses, travel the world. Can he do this because his family is Nigerian, or because he's alive 150 years later than Jarrett? This book is littered with comparisons just there to be made, but Brooks isn't pointing them out. She is trusting you, the reader, and trusting that you will engage with her text, that you will witness how racism has changed and stayed the same over all these years. But I also want to congratulate Brooks. There are a few times where I had critiques of her work as I was reading, and she was aware and she put something in to answer my critiques. For example, Jess generally not being racist. This somehow seems to represent Australia as a set of non-racist people. And let me just say, while we're not racist in the same way Americans are racist, we have our own unique culture of racism here. Brooks understands that this weird interpretation of the novel existed, and it was one of the few times she decided to interfere and direct the reader, letting one of her characters mock Australia's anti-racist efforts, ensuring that you don't subscribe to the idea that Australians as a culture aren't racist. With 3 timelines and several narrators, I found this book challenging to get into. When I started to invest in one character, they would disappear, and by the time they would return, I was more invested in a different character. And I was very close to DNFing this one at one point. But I just found the character of Jess and then that of Theo so engaging. And one of my criticisms is that the 2 historical timelines just didn't compare. I wasn't as interested in those characters, and I just think that Jess and Theo were so much better crafted. The story of Martha Jackson in 1954 hasn't warranted a comment in this review yet. She acquires a painting of Lexington, and I just don't think that this adds anything to the plots and the themes. I think it could have been cut out completely. Unlike the story of both Jess and Jarrett, those stories build towards an ending, and quite a nice ending, quite a good ending. Martha's story just seems to resolve itself like she is a minor plot point. And I mean, I guess she is. Also, I just don't think that these 2 remaining individual storylines add a lot to each other. Brooks really has 2 different books here and has written them together. Yet the tale of Jess and Theo is added to by the story of Jarrett. But I think that a short flashback would have been all that is required. Something that would have placed the ideas down and allowed us to have a slightly narrower focus. Of course, if that was the story, then it would be much less about Lexington. And I think what has really happened for me is that Jess and Theo steal the show. Maybe in Geraldine Brooks's head, Jess was the supporting actor, but for me, she is the protagonist. She is the star. Lexington and Jarrett, they're the side notes. I am nitpicking here. This was a good book and a worthwhile read, but I can't help to think that there was a much better book to be written here. Horse by Geraldine Brooks gets 4 stars. If you like this book, I think you would really enjoy The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. Click here to watch my review of it. Bye bye.